Hey, Mrs. Colgan, just continuing. Mr. Hoodhood, she said, I have not taught you the plays of William Shakespeare for the last 5 months for you to demean them by acting as though they were all about people stabbing each other. I thought that was unfair. But they are, I said. They do it all the time. Macbeth kills Duncan, Macduff kills Macbeth, Brutus kills Julius Caesar, then Brutus kills himself, like when Juliet kills herself after Romeo kills himself, but not before Romeo kills Tybalt. And is that all you've learned from Shakespeare? I thought that was unfair too. Mrs. Baker held out her hand. Give me the book, she said. I opened up my desk. Shakespeare is all about the power of goodness and honesty and faithfulness, she said. It is about the abundance of love. It is about the weakness of armies and battles and guns and... She stopped. Her mouth worked back and forth. It is about the endurance of love, she whispered. Give me the book. I handed it to her at the same moment that the classroom door opened and Mr. Guareschi walked in, accompanied by Mr. Bradbrook and two other members of the school board. Mrs. Baker, said Mr. Guareschi. Mrs. Baker looked at him. Both of our hands were still on Shakespeare. Mrs. Baker, you know Mr. Bradbrook, and of course the chairman of the school board, and Mr. Smilezo, and you know Mrs. Sidman, who has just returned from Connecticut and been appointed to our school board. Mrs. Baker nodded to each one. How good to have you back, Mrs. Sidman, she said. Mrs. Sidman smiled. Her eyes darted around a little bit, like she was expecting something awful to happen, but didn't want to show that she was expecting it. Mrs. Baker is one of our very finest teachers, said Mr. Guareschi. She will have a chance to show that to be true, said Mr. Bradbrook. He pointed to the book that Mrs. Baker and I were still holding. What are you giving to that young mind? He asked. Mrs. Baker looked at me, then back at Mr. Bradbrook. This is a volume of Shakespeare's plays, she said a little weakly. She let go of the book. Mr. Bradbrook came over to my desk and peered at the book. Then he took it from me and weighed it in his hands. He looked at the gilt edges and fingered the red ribbon tied at the spine. This seems like an awfully expensive volume for our schools to be purchasing, he said. It is my own copy, said Mrs. Baker. Mr. Bradbrook was relieved. He looked down at me. Young man, do you think you'll enjoy reading the master's plays? I already do, I said. When I was a boy your age, said Mr. Bradbrook, I would memorize long passages and recite them whenever I was called upon to do so. When you read the master's lines, perhaps you too will be moved to memorize some. Perhaps one day you may even enact some. I already have, I said. Or perhaps Mrs. Baker will assign selected lines to you. Do you think that you might enjoy learning a line or two? He patted the top of my head. Really? He reached out and patted the top of my head. Danny Hopfer nearly fell out of his chair. He has already memorized quite a bit, said Mrs. Baker. Has he? Said Mr. Bradbrook. He seemed sort of surprised. Well, let's hear some from the boy. Mrs. Baker looked down at me. I couldn't really tell what was in her eyes. I thought at first there might be a death threat, but either I'm getting used to them or that wasn't what was there. Hauling Hood, do you know any lines or not? That was from Mr. Guareschi. And I almost said, you block, you stone, you worse than senseless thing, to him. But whatever it was in Mrs. Baker's eyes, it told me that might not be the right thing to say. Probably a Caliban curse wouldn't work either. So I tried something else. This was the noblest Roman of them all the conspirators, save only he, did that they did in envy of great Caesar. He only, in a general honest thought and common good to all, made one of them. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. Merrill clapped. Even Doug Switek clapped. I looked at Mrs. Baker's eyes. Azalea, she said quietly. What was that all about? Said Mr. Bradbrook. The power of goodness and honesty and faithfulness, said Mrs. Baker. Now, if Mr. Guareschi will show you your seats, the class will work through the day's lesson. She went up to the board. This is the sentence you'll be diagramming, she said to us all, and wrote it out. You blocks, you stones, you worse than senseless things. Then she turned to us. Who can identify the implied verb? She asked. For the next hour, we did pretty well by Mrs. Baker. We answered everything she threw at us, and even Doug Switek helped out. He answered the implied verb question. And Mrs. Baker did her part, too. There were no teacher jokes. She never crossed her arms. And when Doug Switek, who I guess thought he was in the rhythm after he got the implied verb question right, called Alfred Lord Tennyson, and you have to admit, it is a bizarre name, Alfred Lord Tennis, Mrs. Baker did not roll her eyes, not even a little. It was an hour of pretty spectacular stuff. Let me tell you, we could have been America's model classroom of 1968. Mrs. Baker was so pleased that she even let me act out the stabbing scene from Julius Caesar after all, probably because she had forgiven all about the soothsayer business, which she shouldn't have, since when I got to the et tu, Brute, then fall, Caesar part, an asbestos ceiling tile over Mrs. Sidman's head that wasn't even bulging suddenly gave way. And it wasn't Julius Caesar who fell. It was Sycorax and Caliban who plummeted onto Mrs. Sidman's lap. I think that she was the only one in the classroom who did not scream, and I'm including Mr. Bradbrook and Mr. Guareschi in that. We all crashed over chairs and tables and desks to the sides of the classroom so that Mrs. Sidman was left completely alone at her student desk with two huge rats in her lap who were shaking their heads and trying to get some idea of what had just happened to them. Then they pulled up their snouts and clacked their yellow teeth. Okay, so I panicked too. After living with the bulging ceiling tiles for all this time, we had gotten to believe that they would never come down. But now we were face to face with huge, scabby, yellow-toothed, angry rats looking at us with eyes reddened with anger. And all we could think about was putting distance between us and them. And I want to point out, for the record, that it was the members of the school board who were up on Mrs. Baker's desk first. Just about everyone else climbed the bookshelves and the window shelf and radiators after throwing aside anything that got in our way. Except for two people. One was my T, who took off one of her shoes and stood behind her desk, ready to swing at anything that had yellow teeth. She looked as fierce as all get out. And the other was Mrs. Sidman, who I guess had determined that nothing more was going to happen to her at Camillo Junior High without her say-so. She grabbed the rats by the back of their necks, which was not easy since they were so fat, pulled them off her lap, and hoisted them into the air. Their paws scrambled, their mouths hissed, their yellow teeth clicked, but Mrs. Sidman didn't care. She stood and held them up, like Macduff holding Macbeth's head. By now, the screams, which had been increasing in volume, had brought Mr. Vendlary. "Where do you want them?" asked the triumphant Mrs. Sidman. "I've got a cage in the basement," he said. "Lead the way," said Mrs. Sidman, and he went ahead of her, closing all of the classroom doors as he went. But I wish that everyone in Camilla Junior High could have seen her, the noblest school board member of them all, Mrs. Sidman, with her vanquished enemies still squirming in her hands, marching to the basement to dispatch them. While the school board members went to have an emergency meeting in Mr. Guareschi's office, we tried to put Mrs. Baker's classroom back together, since absolutely all of the desks had been knocked over. It took most of the day to get everything right. Someone, I think it was Mr. Bradbrook, had knocked the globe of the world off of Mrs. Baker's desk, and there was now a deep valley where the Himalaya mountains had once been. The red Thorndike dictionaries were going to need some help. Most of their covers had come off when we stepped on them to climb higher up the bookshelves. And at least 2 of our desks were gone for good, since all of their legs had splayed out. Julius Caesar's army wouldn't have left such a mess after crossing the Rubicon. That afternoon, Coach Quattrini, held his cross-country tryouts. By then, the story of Sycorax and Caliban was all over school, and so we figured that tryouts might be delayed. And it might be that some coaches somewhere would delay a tryout on an afternoon when some of the tryoutees have just been traumatized by 2 gigantic rats falling out of their classroom ceiling. But Coach Quattrini thought it would give us motivation. "The big M," he said, "motivation. You won't run fast unless you really want to run fast, and really wanting to run fast is what gives you motivation. The big M." He had set out a course for us that stretched to some place beyond human endurance. We were supposed to start at the gym doors and go around the parking lot where Sycorax and Caliban were hissing in their cage, waiting for the exterminator to come put them in his truck. Past the fence that enclosed the tennis courts, out onto Lee Avenue, down past Goldman's Best Bakery, around in the front of the school by the main lobby, behind the elementary school wing, and so back to the gym doors. 4 times, Coach Quattrini said, holding up 4 fingers. "You do that route 4 times, at tempo. Top 7 will be varsity. That'll be all 8th graders, I expect. The rest of you will be junior varsity, if you're good enough to make that, you dang slugs." And with that encouragement, Coach Quattrini blew his whistle and we began. The sky had not improved during the day. The green and brown had swirled together, and the clouds had lowered themselves further and further, and they had dropped a kind of vapor from them that made it seem like we were running through the jungles of Vietnam and breathing more water than air. I leaned forward, and I kept my arms low and my hands loose. I didn't rush it, but even so, by the time I passed Sycorax and Caliban, who hissed and threw themselves against the bars toward me when I kicked their cage to say goodbye, I was already feeling the wet air welling inside me. By the time I came around for the second time, things were slowing down considerably, and every 8th grader and a whole lot of 7th graders were far ahead of me. It's hard to run like Jesse Owens when you're feeling like you're drowning. The 3rd lap was better. Merrill Lee was standing by the main lobby, and when I ran past, she held up a dried rose with a ribbon on it. When a girl holds a rose up to you, you run better, let me tell you. By the time I came around for the 4th lap, I was up to Danny. I had even passed some of the 8th graders, and I could see the leaders in front of me again. I ran past the gym doors. "Can't you go any faster?" from Coach Quattrini, and out into the parking lot where the exterminator truck had pulled up to unload Sycorax and Caliban into their new cage. The sky had lowered itself even more, and everything looked like we were seeing it from underwater in a greenish haze. Even sounds were muffled, so that my footsteps seemed to come from far away. But what wasn't muffled was the cry that came from the exterminator behind me, the sound of a large cage dropping, a scream, and the clicking of clacking teeth. I looked back, and there were their demon rats racing with